welcome to another history lesson as the Sevastopol School District celebrates its 100th anniversary. So back in the 1800s and the early 1900s, it was very common to have a number of small or one-room schoolhouses throughout rural areas, all playing an important part in our education. There were 7 small schools in the Sevastopol community, plus schools in Greater Sevastopol, which included Jacksonport, West Jacksonport, and Carlsville. So although the Sevastopol district consolidated in the early 1920s, many of those small schools stayed open for several years, even after the consolidation. However, by 1965, those small schoolhouses had stopped operating as educational facilities, and Sevastopol entered its modern era. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce our presenter tonight, Mr. Steve Rice. He is the Door County Museum and Archives Manager, and Steve and his museum team have put together the history and legacy of those schoolhouses. So although the schoolhouses might be gone, the memories and their legacies remain. So without further ado, Mr. Steve Rice.
Thank you so much, Linda, for that great introduction. And I'm going to try holding it like this. If there are any issues, we'll try different orientations. Okay, I tend to get a little bit animated. So thank you again for inviting me here today to the Sevastopol Historical Society, and of course to the community of Sevastopol as well for welcoming me in, so to speak, in this way. I'd like to take this moment right now, before we get started, to acknowledge really the basics of everything that you're about to see here today. And that's research that was conducted about 10 years ago now by the staff of the Door County Historical Museum, with a lot of help from other groups and individuals throughout this county, that presented at that time the first comprehensive survey of our county schoolhouses. The leads on that project were Judy Jesse, Ginny Hain, and Nyla Small. And Ginny Hain in particular was responsible for the portion of that research that covered Sevastopol. Without her research, I couldn't do this, and future researchers would have a lot more work to do. She did thankless work, and I think we all should give her a round of applause there. So before I get started, I just want to talk a little bit about Sevastopol, because I have a little confession to make at the beginning. It's very shameful. I'm not from Sevastopol. In fact, I'm from Southern Door, and if you're asking people down there whether I'm from there, I probably am not, because I moved there when I was 1. So don't ask me my last name. It doesn't mean anything. I'm not related to anyone else in Door County. That gives me some strengths and weaknesses doing this. I admit that I feel a little bit like a house guest who's just come into the house and is trying to figure out where to sit down. The strength, I think, that I bring to this kind of work, not being from here, is that I have a certain perspective, right? I have a certain above-ground perspective, perhaps, and I'm coming at Sevastopol with a fresh set of eyes, with no preconceived notions whatsoever. Now, of course, the weakness of that is that I don't have what many of you have, which is a deep personal connection to the place. Long-standing family connections and that deep affection that can only really come from growing up around or near a place. So my hope here is a couple of things. My first is that you'll be patient with me. If I get little details wrong or miss something that's very important to you, I promise it isn't intentional, and in fact, I want to hear about it. Whether it's after our presentation today or later on, if you want to give me a call, I want to hear about all the personal history that you have, and I want you to tell me all of the little details I got wrong, all the big picture stuff I got wrong, all of those things, because you bring something that I never can. And the other part that I want to really hope to bring here today is that we can find a meeting of the minds, that your on-the-ground perspective and my above-ground perspective can help us all appreciate this very special place a little bit more, because in my mind, when we practice history at the museum, that's what history really is all about. And certainly, through doing this research, I feel that I've come to appreciate Sevastopol a great deal more. I mean, look at it there. That's how most researchers initially see it, as in a flat map. Looks a little bit like the state of Iowa, actually. I never really realized that. And it's a little bit hard to define, between Sturgeon Bay and Gibraltar, Jackson, Port Egg Harbor, that whole nexus. I've always had a little bit of trouble, personally, as a historian, figuring out where Sevastopol fits. I don't have that problem anymore. And every time that I go into Sevastopol from now on, I'm going to have, I think, a much deeper appreciation for the community. So the way we're going to approach this is at kind of different levels. So we're going to start with the big picture. You can't really talk about the history of Sevastopol schoolhouses without talking about the history of education in Wisconsin, because it, of course, grew out of that, and they're deeply, deeply intertwined. So we're going to start there and run through education in Wisconsin from the very beginnings all the way through what I'm going to call the early modern period, which is up to about 1973. From there, we're going to take a grand tour going back to that Sevastopol level. So we're going to see every single one of those schoolhouses, everything we have on them in our history, and points of interest, when they were built, all those things, and what's left of them today. And then finally, I'm going to wrap up, and we're going to take a broader look at what schoolhouses mean to us, and maybe some ideas about how we should think about those schoolhouses today, and what place they sit, and where they sit in Door County history. So let's start with that big picture. That's not Door County, by the way. That's Columbus down in that area, but it's just too good a picture to pass up. My gosh, is that beautiful. They made it just for my big picture title. We're going to look at the origins of public education in Wisconsin, and then we're going to break the history of education in Door County up into 3 eras. These are completely arbitrary, and I made them up for this talk. The frontier schools era, the one-room schoolhouse era, and then finally the history of consolidation and what we're calling that early modern era. So some things to remember before we get started. School history is extremely complicated, extremely complicated. There are tons of ins and outs because there is no one way that any community approached education. Every community solved these problems in a slightly different way that reflected that community's needs. So there's no one size fits all. I can talk about eras, I can talk about the overall development of education and where Sevastopol sits in that in Door County's history. But if you go to Gibraltar or Southern Door, it's a different story. And even as you go between schools in the district, it's a different story. So let's make sure that we remember that as we move forward, that this is, we're just painting with a very, very broad brush. Let's talk a little bit about how education actually came to Wisconsin in the way that we know it, public schooling. Because in the very beginnings of America, of course, there were no public schools, and schooling was accomplished in a variety of ways. Sometimes local parents would pool resources and start a school for their group of children. Other times, of course, it was private education for one individual, private academies. It really was a hodgepodge. But one thing that was always there, really baked into our national identity, was the belief that education was important to who we were as people in America. And that started right away. If you look at, for instance, the 1785 land ordinance, anyone who's a history nerd might know what I'm talking about. This is what established how we do surveys and sell land in the West at that time. So it created our tracts and our plots and how we do zoning now. It all came out of that land ordinance. And that ordinance, which was in 1785, very early in our history, set aside the 16th section of every single township in America for a school. So the idea, of course, was that no matter how they did it, every township should at least try to have some form of education available to its citizens. Now, not every one of those sections actually had school, and not all of them have it now, but it's the kind of thought that counts. Public schools, as we know them, don't really get underway until the 1830s. And that's where this fellow that you see here with the chiseled jaw comes in. That's Horace Mann. Some teachers around might know who that is. Generally considered to be the father of public education in America. He's a Massachusetts legislator, also very active in the anti-slavery movement, and a strong believer in what we would call public education today. His great idea is what he called the normal school. And normal, I mean a standardized school. This is the idea that every person in America should have access to a certain level of education. 3 R's, of course, reading, writing, and arithmetic, and also something that we would call maybe the humanities or the liberal arts. So a little bit of music, a little bit of history, a little bit of culture, maybe a little classics, things like that. So basically the level of education that was available only to private students at that point should be available to everyone. And it's a very radical idea, and it wasn't implemented overnight. So how did it make it to Wisconsin? Well, there's a couple of things that happened in our history early on that made Wisconsin actually one of the most progressive educational states in the nation. And it really has to do with the folks from the East Coast who ended up coming here and from elsewhere as well. First, we have a lot of folks in Wisconsin in the 1830s and 40s coming from New England. They're coming from Massachusetts, they're coming from Connecticut. These are Yankees, and they're settling in generally the southeastern part of the state. Typically, they're pretty radical people. They believe in progressive education. They're also very much against slavery, and they bring all of those ideas with them to the new state of Wisconsin and kind of bake it into our national character. So that's where Mann's ideas are coming from. There's also another strain of progressive thought or educational thought that's coming in at this time, and that's coming from German immigrants or 48ers. These are upper middle class Germans who had participated to some level in the revolutions that swept Europe in 1848 and had to leave because things got a little bit hot over there, and they come to America. They're also anti-slavery. They formed the backbone of the Union Army during the Civil War, and they also have some really what we would consider progressive ideas about education. For instance, the first kindergarten in America actually happened in Watertown, and that is coming from a very famous German immigrant who was involved in the movement to create kindergarten in Germany and brought it here. So Wisconsin has this, and it's baked into our legislature, it's baked into our government, to the point where in 1840, the territorial legislature, this is 8 years before statehood, remember, makes it a law, a requirement, that every township should have some form of publicly funded, tax-funded education, to which all the citizens of Wisconsin Territory said, go whistle up a tree. It didn't work very well, and education was an incredible hodgepodge. If we're looking at kind of the challenges that folks faced with that particular thing, it was everything across the board. Where do you get teachers from in 1840? Where do you get standardized textbooks? Where do these children go to school? A log cabin, a hole in the ground, it would be all those things. So it was a very, very difficult thing to do, and despite all those big aspirations, the territory of Wisconsin didn't have the muscle to make any of that happen, really. But the push is still there, and it's baked into our Constitution. It's something that's very integral to who we are as a state. To the point where education becomes very, very foundational to Door County. So schools here in Door County were organized in 1861. It's pretty early on. Sevastopol Township's only organized in 1859, and they're already starting to talk about public schools 2 years later. And it comes in very quickly here, and it's made the responsibility of this gentleman you see here with a large beard. That's Milton E. Lyman. He's one of those interesting Door County characters that was kicking around here in the 1860s. He did a little bit of everything. He was a county judge, he was a county clerk of court. He was just generally very involved. And he gets appointed the first superintendent of Door County education. And you see there on the right the very first legal notice in the Door County Advocate, which just started printing, by the way, of the organization of our schools. And you'll notice that the school districts have been established. There's 7 of them, covering all the towns that existed at that time, including some that don't exist anymore. Note that District Number 7, if you can see, is Chambers Island. So they're trying to organize the county based on the populations that are there right now. And that causes some pretty serious problems. Milton Lyman has maybe the worst job imaginable. He has to do basically everything related to education here in the county. He assesses teachers, he assesses schools, he has to make sure that the whole system, top to bottom, is running. And I want to share this quote, it's kind of a famous one, from his last report in 1863, before he retired after 2 years from this job. He's writing to the state superintendent of schools in Madison. Since my last annual report to you, I have held 8 public examinations and 7 special examinations. I've granted 30 certificates, and I have rejected 7 applications and made 37 visits to schools. My county is about 100 miles long by 16 to 20 wide, and not 1 mile of public conveyance in the county. I have traveled 1,142 miles, 1,022 on foot, for school purposes in the past year. There are 29 districts in the county, an increase of 4 districts in the past year. So you can see the district system isn't really working. It keeps changing quite a bit. Our county, in common with all new counties, has suffered from delinquent taxes, rendering almost impossible to hire teachers or to pay them at the expiration of their term of office. Door County is improving fast in schoolroom accommodations, but is yet sadly deficient. We want more commodious and better ventilated schoolrooms, maps, globes, and school apparatus. And what we most want is the active cooperation of school boards and parents with teachers. Folks who are in school administration, and some things have changed, but has everything changed? Since 1863? So you can already see the many problems and kind of imagine what a huge task this is to try to impose this level of education on a county like ours, which is so spread out. And the problems really do run the gamut, and they're consistent throughout the history of our education. Organization. How do we get towns, the county, and the state on the same page and get them funding schools in the proper way? Speaking of funding, financing. Tax dollars are supposed to go to schools. Who ensures that that happens? How much? And how do they get to the schools in question and equitably? A huge question, which is always a problem, is attendance. In the early days, getting kids to school and getting parents to agree to send kids to school was a huge, huge task. And there really wasn't any mechanism to force it to happen, especially out on the frontier. Faculty. Who do we have teaching kids? Where are the teachers and how are they trained? In the early days of the frontier, often teachers were barely better educated than the children they were teaching, and there was really no process of proper certification unless Mr. Lyman here decided that you were up to snuff. And finally, facilities. And you can see, this is not in Sevastopol, but above Mr. Lyman here is Blossomburg School, which is a school of this era. It's a log cabin, folks, with one window. Makes it very hard to do reading, writing, and arithmetic, especially when the sun isn't shining in the right angle. And of course, it's damp, it's cold in the winter, it's roasting in the summer. It's a miserable place to be. All of those things that are going to tell kids maybe it's better off if I'm running around or working on the farm than going to school. So it's a real challenge. And these challenges can stay very, very consistent. As things get more organized, as we move toward 1879, as we move out of the Civil War era, things become more organized, the school districts become more settled, but these problems persist until solutions begin to be found around 1879. So we move into what I'm calling the expansion era. The state realizes that they can't just leave superintendents like Lyman out in the cold. They have to give them more resources. And you start to see that happen. So state assistance to schools increases, and it evens out those peaks and valleys between poorer districts and more wealthy districts, and enables more growth and quality. A big change that happens is in 1879. That makes schooling compulsory. For the first time, you have to send your kids to school. Was that equally enforced? No. But they tried. And this begins to create these structures that we can then use to make sure that everybody is getting kind of the same level of education. As far as training, normal schools start being created for teachers. And this is a huge development. It allows teachers to get very quick, very efficient training, which with the high turnover of teachers at this time is very important. So we start to see standardized systems that make sure kids are getting a consistent quality of education from teacher to teacher. And finally, the facilities problems start getting solved because they start creating standardized patterns for schools. Now this varies from state to state, but often states would create a standardized book of schoolhouse designs that every school district could draw on to use, making sure that certain things like ventilation, adequate windows, decent facilities are all being created at a kind of a consistent basis. This is the era when Sevastopol schoolhouses are largely built. So we will be returning to this era in a little bit when we look over those schoolhouses. However, more money and more resources, as the saying goes, means more problems that need to be solved. And this is a consistent theme that we're going to be returning to again and again. As we put more resources to educate more kids with a growing population, it creates the need for further resources. As the schools get bigger, we need to pump more resources into them, which makes the schools grow, etc., and so forth. How do communities keep up? We're starting to see a divide between urban and rural at this time. Urbanization explodes after the Civil War, which means more kids, more resources, bigger schools, and we really start to see a difference between what rural schools are getting and what city schools are getting in terms of size, amenities, all these things. And this is going to keep magnifying as we move farther away from 1880. This is important to the history of Sevastopol. And finally, high schools start to happen. So, education in the frontier. First through 8th grade, roughly, maybe. As we start getting into the 1870s, more and more students are starting to look for a higher level of education, which was only available at private academies up until that point, to the point in 1875 where the state legislature authorizes school districts to start high schools. This is a major pressure. That's 4 more grades, that's a different building that they need to build, and it's taking kids off the farm out of other activities. So the demand for high schools and the push for high schools is going to continue to expand, and we're going to see that more and more. Until, finally, we get to what I'm calling the modern era. That's a big era, isn't it? 1911 through 1973, and that's based strictly on Door County. 1973 is the point where the last consolidated school was built. There's my alma mater, Southern Door. Late to the party, but we're great. Love them. Go Eagles. And this is where really the features of our modern school system take shape. Still challenges, but we're starting to get some of these things kind of buttoned down and solved. Communities are getting bigger, schools are getting bigger, costs are getting bigger, and all those one-room schoolhouses, which have been the bread and butter of American education for the past 50, 60, 70 years, just can't handle it anymore. So these facilities needs are great. And look at these schools here, you're starting to see them getting much, much larger. As schools get larger and become consolidated, they need better transportation. And so bigger populations are making combination very attractive. As the car develops, it's easier to get kids around. They don't need to walk to school, they don't need to take a horse cart to school, so it's more advantageous to have a bigger school in a central location. And you're starting to see competition really heating up with cities. This is when rural districts really start feeling the pinch and falling behind. Because as the world gets more modern, high school stops being just an option and becomes more and more mandatory to succeed in the future. And districts that don't have high schools or only have one high school in the community really start to suffer. And this is the moment when you see Sevastopol become what it is today. Consolidation is, of course, that process of moving schools together and combining them into one larger school that is going to encompass all the grade levels needed. And this is where you start to see very different solutions happening in our county. We're going to push this to the county level. The first consolidated school in Door County is Gardner. I know, Gardner, at the head of the class today. Yeah, that's right. A small consolidation. It's only 3 schools coming together into one. Unfortunately, they just tore it down. They just built Gardner Consolidated School. It's been in bad shape for years. But larger consolidations do happen, and of course, we're standing in the example that was most prominent. Sevastopol schools consolidated in 1918, and the school that actually houses that consolidation is built in 1924. Most other schools in Door County take a different route, which is more common too across the country and the state, in that they kind of try to do a hybrid. They create high schools. Gibraltar creates its first high school in 1918 to house those upper 4 grades. And they also expand their facilities, they make bigger facilities that can accommodate some of these big needs, but they don't put everybody under one roof. They still try to create a new version, a more modern version of the one-room schoolhouse. If you want to see examples of what those look like, head down to Southern Door, head up to Liberty Grove. We have many of them remaining. And that means that they don't really see consolidation happening until much, much later, into the 1950s, even the 1960s. And of course, our last school consolidates in the 1970s. And that overall pattern is typical. Sevastopol, way ahead of the game. Interesting. That was a surprise to me when I first did my research. So that's the general outline of where we're going. There's Brussels High School up there. That's one of the last. That consolidated in the 1970s. Sturgeon Bay very early on. And the presence of Sturgeon Bay, the pressure that Sturgeon Bay created on the other rural school districts is one of the reasons Sevastopol did what it did. And then finally there, Gibraltar in the lower corner. And you see that gym in the back, that was the 1940s. They built that first little building in 1918 and thought that would be enough. Already 20 years later, they're having to tack things onto it. And it really becomes a struggle. So, deep breath. The whole history of education in Door County, with no issues. Let's go back to our schoolhouses. We're going back to that early stage, that kind of middle stage, really. 1880, we're starting to get organized. We're starting to get an idea of what we need in education. The county is becoming, more committed to this idea of public education, but it's still a one-room schoolhouse. What does that look like? Well, there they are, folks. There are all 8 of them, all spread out. And there are things to notice about this and patterns that we're going to see as we move through these schools. First, schools follow people. That's our principle. So we're going to do these chronologically, and as we go through the chronology of how these were built, it is a nice bit of evidence of where people were living in Sevastopol and how this community was growing. Schools follow people. The second principle that we'll always remember, we're going to see it right away, is the pull of Sturgeon Bay. Large communities draw students and create kind of a nexus, right, for schools. Sturgeon Bay, immediately to the south, is a constant presence in Sevastopol school history, right up until the modern day, I'm sure. And that was always a feature. So any school that's near the Sturgeon Bay is going to be influenced by it, and you're going to see that in their histories. We need to talk about a little bit about Greater Sevastopol. So this is Sevastopol Township, but that does not mean that Sevastopol schooling was limited to those borders. So when we're talking about Greater Sevastopol, we're talking about Carlsville, we're talking about Jacksonport, and we're also talking about Sturgeon Bay Township and certain schools that were there, particularly Evergreen and those schools that were down near the canal. Those are also kind of influenced by Sevastopol, and Sevastopol is influencing them. They take students from the Sevastopol Township, and they also contribute students. And they also will send, once the consolidation happens, they'll start sending students to the new high school as well. So they're all part of Sevastopol's orbit. So look at these schools, and if you know Sevastopol well, and I assume you do, you can see that some of them are in kind of unusual places. They're a little bit isolated. I just want to emphasize this, though, that there is a rhyme or reason to the way that these are organized. There was a principle in the creation of one-room schoolhouses which dictated how they were built, and that was that there should be no student who is more than 2 miles away from a schoolhouse. Why 2 miles? Because that's the distance that they felt was appropriate for a child to walk to and from school. So, as you can see, if you look at this, and we drew a little circle around these, you would see every one of those sections is a mile square, that we have roughly that principle in application here. Now, I don't want to imagine what it was like to actually walk 2 miles to school and then 2 miles back. But in the mind of those who were planning these schools, that was how the layout happened. And we should also remember, too, that this wasn't all planned at once. These schools grew up as needs evolved. So this was not planned out on a map and then just plunked down. It evolved and grew, kind of like a tree. So let's talk a little bit about what are we talking about with Sevastopol schoolhouses. We're talking about schoolhouses built between roughly 1881 and 1898. We don't know for sure. They are wood frame structures. So classic wooden buildings, not particularly sturdy. And until Cherry School was built in 1905, brick is not part of the equation here. They're front gable, so the open end of the roof is facing forward. Very simple buildings, very utilitarian buildings. Most of them, but not all, have bell towers. And these are probably standard plan. Now, I have not been able to find the plan book that they were using for these schools, and I'm not even sure if we had one for Door County or for the state of Wisconsin at this time. But they are all very similar in their design, which indicates to me that they were probably pulling from some standardized set of blueprints. They weren't trying to reinvent the wheel. And finally, we'll talk about why this happened at the end. Every single one of them was sold in 1924, and only one of them remains today, which is completely unique in all of Door County. We'll talk about why that happened. So let's begin. Let's begin at the beginning with the black sheep. This is it is, and for many reasons. So this is the Bay Shore School. So you Sevastopol historians know that while there's multiple areas where Sevastopol was first settled, the real first nexus of what we would call community in the township of Sevastopol is on the Bay Shore, just north of Sturgeon Bay. So this is where, in that initial push in 1861-63, they first start establishing a school. We can look at it on a map where this is in just a little bit, but the first school is built just kind of midway up the Bay Shore. It's a log school. This is the only photo we have of a log school in the town of Sevastopol, by the way. So this is evidence of what it would have looked like. This is much later on in 1905 when this photo was taken. But you can see, looking at that little log cabin, you can imagine was not a particularly commodious way to go to school. So it was replaced pretty late though, in 1891 by this frame building that you see right next to it. However, it didn't last long. Both schools are destroyed by fire in the February of 1905. And actually the Laurie House, which is right across the street, ended up hosting the students for a little while they rebuilt the school. And they ultimately end up relocating it down the road to the intersection of Gordon Road and Cherry Road, where it still remains today as the Cherry School. It was rebuilt in brick, the only brick school, until of course the Consolidated School is built in Sevastopol. Points of interest for this are many. Obviously, this is the only photograph we have of a pioneer school that tells us how it would have been in Sevastopol. We want to talk about proximity to Sturgeon Bay. This one is the one where Sturgeon Bay's presence is deeply felt at all times. This has always been as much a Sturgeon Bay or more a Sturgeon Bay school as it was a Sevastopol school, and the tug of war between the two townships over this particular property began very early on. And often, you'll see the history of this school is framed more in terms of Sturgeon Bay than Sevastopol. As the center of gravity in Sevastopol shifts more to the Institute, that gets more and more intense. So this is the lost district. Linda said there were 7 districts, and there were the Consolidated and Sevastopol School. This is the one that opted out and stayed as Cherry School, and that did continue right up really through the modern day. It resisted consolidation in 1924, and eventually it merged with the Sturgeon Bay School District in 1964 in an unbelievably contentious court case that came very close to making it to the state Supreme Court. So the two townships fought tooth and nail over this school, and they eventually, through a judge's decision, went with Sturgeon Bay. And of course, it ceased operation 10 years later, so it was all worth all those legal costs, of course. This is the only Sevastopol schoolhouse you're going to see built in the new style. So take a look at this. If you can see under the awnings, or if you just go out there, it's worth looking at. It's abandoned now, sadly. This is the only one that's going to have kind of a more modern feel. It doesn't have the front gable. A lot of our brick schoolhouses or schoolhouses built after 1900 in Door County look like this. And of course, if you want to see exactly where it was, let's see if I can pull this up. So if you want to see where the site was for the original schoolhouse, which is long abandoned since 1905, but there's still something there. Just head up Bayshore Drive, go past Bayshore Inn, until you're just about to Westwood Shores. And you will see, go back here, take a look at this. Oh my goodness, what's this? See, this is what I get for getting fancy. All right, you will see this. You'll see this little path leading up on your right into a little plateau area. I don't know what's back there. And I want to say too that I'm going to show you where every one of these modern schools was. Every single one of these is on private property. So please respect the rights of those property owners. These are not places that you can just go. I think that there's value to knowing where they were, and there's opportunities for our historic professionals in Sevastopol to maybe form some relationships, which we can talk about, but please do not go hiking back in there. But the site is still there, and I can only imagine that if you dug down about half an inch, you would find something. So that's Cherry School. That's the black sheep. It was the first, and it was the last, and it's still there and in growth. Let's go to one that was a little bit similar, a little bit different. This is Lakeside School, one of our most isolated. So this is established a little later, and as in established, I mean the land is bought for it, this little 1 acre square. And it's built probably in the early mid-1880s. There may have been a pioneer school. We don't know. We don't know a lot about a lot of these schools, and that's a through line that you're going to see happening again and again. But it is definitely built by 1886 when we have our first list of schools in Door County. This is actually a joint district with Sturgeon Bay Town for a lot of its history. So again, you're seeing the pull of Sturgeon Bay, Evergreen just to the south, the canal just to the south, Sturgeon Bay just a hop, skip, and a jump away. So despite being no bigger than any of the others, this actually has one of the largest class sizes. There was a period where over 100 students were at this one-room schoolhouse. In theory, that's who was on the register. Were all of them there at one time? Were all of them going to school? Almost certainly not. But because it's pulling from both Sevastopol in the north and Sturgeon Bay Township to the south, it's filling in a lot of gaps. where it is right now. We're going to try this again. You'd be very hard-pressed to find it in anything other than a satellite view. It's a very isolated portion of the county. But you can see here, a little zigzag, Mary, Gilbert, this is in your neck of the woods.
We're not seeing it, by the way. Your PowerPoint's been
Oh my
staying
gosh,
up.
I'm so sorry. Well, if you go to the intersection of County View Road and Gore Road, you'll see a little section of trees. It's there. There's a little clearing. It's still a separate plot, which is interesting. It's not owned by the landowner to the, it's owned by a different landowner, actually. And you're going to see something. Again, one of those situations where if you went back in those woods, you would probably find some things lying on the ground or sticking out of the ground. But no evidence of a school at all. It's also not near the lake, and you'll notice if you do some research that the names of these change a lot. And this is a great example of why. This is Bassford School. It's on the corner of Matthew Road and Dunn. So kind of right off of what is now modern Highway 42, and right by, on the same block, if you were, as the old Sevastopol Town Hall. I kind of grouped this and the following ones all together. They're established in the early 1880s, probably earlier. So these are now schools that are in the agricultural heart of Sevastopol, in that rich farming area in the middle. And they're really coming up to help to service that farm community, again in the early 1880s, and again probably earlier. So point of interest, this is at a very central location. Again, the town hall is just down the road, the post office is just down the road. Something else we should note is the association with George Bassford. It's called the Bassford School because it's on George Bassford's land. He owned a very large tract of land in Sevastopol history, one of the first Sevastopol settlers, and he's deeply involved in the school. It's very common. Usually, who's on the school boards for these things, right? Who's the school clerk? It's going to be local landowners. It's going to be local people. Schools like this are a great avenue for community involvement for folks who typically would not be involved in community, and this is how we grow our civic culture in America. Now, George Bassford was very prominent in basically every aspect of Sevastopol history while he was alive, but he also was deeply involved in the school, and he carried his name right up until the end. After he passed away, it was renamed Dunn School. I want to also point out, there it is, there's the corner, and you'll see there's a little concrete plot over here, a little concrete pad. We found in 1919 a note in the newspaper that Bassford School had just gotten a new flagpole with a concrete pad and a new pole. And now it's all that's left of Bassford School sitting right there on the corner for anyone who goes by. Got a very strange note from the person who was doing this property. All these shots are from last Friday, by the way, so they're very current. Zettel School, kind of a twin to Bassford in a lot of ways. Established in 1882, possibly earlier. They may have also been a pioneer school here. And this is someplace that's very prominent, but there's nothing left of it. It's just down the road from Bassford School, actually on the highway. Does anyone own the house that's in this picture? You're not embarrassed? Okay, good. I worried about that. As you go past the split in the highway, everybody sees it. As you're heading up Highway 42, you'll see this little ranch house on the right. That is the site of Zettel School. It was built right over it. There's very little left there now, except for the trees, which you can see in aerial photographs. So those trees were not planted by the landowner, they were planted for the school, and they're all that is left of it. I just want to point out Zettel School for a couple reasons. It's one of the few we actually have a photo of, so you see classic front gable, classic bell tower, classic wood frame school. Lots of photos of kids who went there. And also, we'll talk about this, this is the birthplace of the Consolidation movement. So a lot of rabble-rousers in the parents of people at Zettel School. There was something in the air, something in the water there in the 19-teens that we'll get into. So don't let the looks fool you. It's a radical, radical part of York County. Moving to the other side of the county, we see Whitefish Bay. Now, this is obviously another area where there's a lot of population density around this time in 1880. Not so much anymore. But at this time, 1880, 1885, Whitefish Bay is booming with the lumber industry and other things. So this is a natural place for them to have a school. In fact, they actually had two. The first one was in Whitefish Bay proper, just off the shore. And that lasts for about 10 years. So it's voluntarily moved in 1891. And this is a good indication of what I mean when I say the schools follow people. By 1891, Whitefish Bay is already 8. And the population and all the energy is starting to move closer toward that central part of the county. So there was a reason, because we wanted to be 2 miles away, remember, to start moving the school. It's the only real example we have of a voluntary school relocation, not a fire, not a disaster. So up top you see the first school, that was the one in Whitefish Bay proper, and on the bottom, the only picture we have of the second Whitefish Bay school is this one here. So you only see the door, you don't see the actual school itself. And it was up in the northern part of Sevastopol. You can see just off of what's now 57, and all that's left, actually quite a bit. Now it's a very small photo. You see there's juniper bushes all around, there's nothing here, this is scrubland now. But you'll see this little rock pile, that is a pile of concrete. That is the foundation of the school. So we actually have something left there for the archaeologists to get into if you wish. Maybe worth investigating, who knows. Now we're going to move to what I like to call the expansion schools, which are, as the population is shifting after 1880, there's starting to be some big changes in Sevastopol. Ag becomes bigger, all those logging communities that were churning over there by Whitefish Bay and Lily Bay in the south, those are starting to die off. And now we have to have schools to service the shifting population. So now we have Fairmont School. Fairmont School is in the north central part of the township. And as you can see in that photo, there's a whole lot left of it, folks. It is a farm field. And this is a great illustration of single biggest destroyer of cultural heritage imaginable is agriculture. If any building that was on an active farm field, there won't be much left. But it's also a good illustration of kind of the relationship between agriculture and these schools. Because often, initially, the school district would not own the land. It would actually be rented to them by the farmer in question. So when all these schools were sold in 1924, we have a couple examples of schools that were immediately just bought up by the same family or whoever owned that lot and then converted back to agriculture. So it is hard to see a school absolutely vanish into thin air. Nothing left of it physically. But I think there is something that is left of these schools that illustrates kind of a deeper connection to the community. There may be something to actually feel a little bit positive about. Who knows? A similar story here in Low Valley. This is an expansion school. It's just to the east of here. Drive down Dunn Road, you go right past it. You would never know. It's at a low point, as the name would indicate, right outside of Institute. So again, all of that activity that's happening in the west is starting to contract toward Institute and Valley, that sort of line. And they need new schools in the late 1880s to help to service that. So they're filling out that map. It is close to Institute, which is of interest. They needed 2 flanking it. And if you go down there, you'll just see this little bay of farmland extending out between 2 areas of lowland, creek, wetland. But if you look at aerial photographs, sometimes, if you're lucky, you will see that in the plowing patterns in the field, there is evidence of a little square, which does happen. Even if you disturb the land, sometimes, because of the different densities involved, there will still be some level of evidence. So it was there. There's also a little pile of debris over here in this swampy wetland area, which I wonder sometimes if that is school related. So again, worth investigating. And finally, we get to district number 8, Hilltop School. The last and the last remaining. So this is established and built in 1898. Much later than any of the other ones. And this is interesting for a variety of reasons, because look where it is. You see this map here, you can see right down here is the stone quarry. So this is up on the far western side of the township, south of Little Harbor, in the heart of Cherryland. And in 1898, all of a sudden, Cherryland starts to become a lot more populated. And that becomes a center of gravity for industry, it becomes a center of gravity for kids. And it will continue to be as fruit pickers continue to come in. So we need a school. This is the last wood frame schoolhouse built in Sevastopol, and it is the only example still standing today. It is barely standing today. Anyone who's been past there or lives near there knows that in the last couple of years the roof has caved in Apparently the floor is also caving in as well. It survived only, to my knowledge, because it was used as a storage facility by the surrounding orchards at the time. And even in 1965, this was the only school that was still left. So it really is a bit of a living fossil. And this is the point where I do my call to arms. I will say that because there are people in this room who are more connected and more in tune with the details of Sevastopol's history than I can ever be, if they're looking for a project, reaching out to this landowner and getting permission to look at the school, explore the school, do something with the school, this is all you've got left. It's worth thinking about. And I'm not saying it can be saved. I don't think that that's in the cards. It would be more of a rebuilding. But there is no other example of this era left in the county, in Sevastopol. And so it's as good a target for history-minded folk as any I can think of. So where the heck did they go? Why don't we have them anymore? There's schoolhouses all over this county. Everybody's thinking for schoolhouses. Why don't we have schoolhouses in Sevastopol? Well, because we have this beautiful consolidated school, is the short answer. It's the consolidation battle, and by the way, if anyone has any documentation of the consolidation fight, all of the minutes and things of what happened in 1917, 18 through 24, oh boy, do I want to see those, because the legends are really exciting and I want to confirm them. Calls for consolidation were happening from a very early period. Like I said before, we have this pressure from city schools, and by the 19-teens, it's getting real bad for folks who live out here. There's no high school until 1918 in Northern Door that's accessible, which means that if you are a parent and you want to send your student to high school, you have to send them to live in Sturgeon Bay and board in Sturgeon Bay to go to Sturgeon Bay High School if they don't live close enough to town to travel. That's obviously a huge impediment to education, especially in Sevastopol and in Northern Door. 1918, Gibraltar builds a high school building, so that helps a little bit. But there is still no high school facility here in Sevastopol Township proper. Also, schoolhouses are in terrible shape. Now, as we saw with the Cherry, by the turn of the century, they really started rebuilding in brick and stucco, things that were a little more durable. Those wood frame schoolhouses did not last particularly well. There was a desperate need across the board for better facilities, more room, all those things. So something had to give. And what actually ended up kind of pushing Sevastopol over the edge was the war. This is World War I. So in World War I, and this is, again, what I need to confirm. These are legends from the newspaper. I want to know how accurate they are. They're amazing. Mrs. Waldemar Daust and her sewing circle are meeting at Zettel School. They are sewing and knitting items for the soldiers across the pond. And they're talking about the need for education. And it is from them that we first start getting a major push from the community to consolidate Sevastopol schools all together, all under one roof, in the way that has been happening in the cities for a long time, that has happened in Sturgeon Bay to some extent, but never before in the county have we seen the idea of having everybody under one roof. Usually there'll be a junior high, a senior high, no, they're all under one roof. That's the idea. It is a radical idea. At this time, there is no school like this in a rural area in Wisconsin. So this was a bold move. It was really pushing Sevastopol a whole generation ahead of where the other schools in the county were and the direction that they were going. And apparently, I just found out earlier, it was met with a great deal of pushback from the community. Now, these always work. And there are legitimate reasons to push back against these kind of big efforts. One is cost. It's tremendously expensive to build a school like this. And as you can see, from what we've just seen, the level of school that the community was used to, this was a whole other ballgame. They were looking at schools in major cities, in Milwaukee and Madison, as an inspiration. So it was a big pill to swallow for the community to get behind this and to take the huge economic hit, the increase in taxes to pay for this. And in fact, it turns out that it ended up being backbreaking for some of the local farmers. So there are legitimate reasons to push back against this. This was a truly radical idea. But there are things that made it possible here. In this moment, this rare moment in history that allowed Sevastopol to be what it is today. And one is Mr. and Mrs. Waldemar Daust and her group of mothers who knew the community and were very adamant about pushing this idea through. And the other is a really extraordinary figure who deserves a book, and her name is Catherine Conley, later Catherine Stapleton. She was the secret weapon, sorry, I missed the end there. This is a really extraordinary person. So in 1915, she's a teacher. In 1915, she is appointed the supervisor of rural schools in Door County. So kind of the second in command of the county school superintendent. Also the chief teacher of Door County. She is heading up all the rural business, and she's also inspecting all the teachers, the division of labor. She is 25 years old in 1950. Incredible, and already had 2 years of this under her belt. So a very driven, very intelligent, very progressive person. She rises rapidly in the kind of school bureaucracy here in Door County. She becomes the school superintendent. When B.E. Madden, Mike, is this a relative? He is called up to war in 1918. He goes over to Europe. Her immediate superior. She's the natural choice. She fills his shoes. She is a powerful advocate for consolidation, and she is the single driving force behind the building of Sevastopol School and the consolidation of the district before that. Not only that, but she pushes hard for consolidation on the west side of Sturgeon Bay as well. And ends up leaving before Sevastopol is completed in 1923, gets more education, comes back eventually, marries Grover Stapleton, the local judge, and lives out her life here as a powerful community member in a variety of capacities. So a real power couple there, but a really powerful and interesting figure. And the result is that a new consolidated high school was built between 1921 and 24. Pretty long time to build a high school. It was a foundation for about half of that. Money ran out, they had to find more money. All of those pain points that we know and love in big construction projects were very much present in this as well. But in 1924, it finally opens. And immediately, you see the notice in the paper right there, immediately that summer, the schoolhouses are all listed for sale. And the reason, again, I find this out talking to folks, but I suspected as much, so that we can't go back. No going back, we're selling the schools, we are committing, we are going to be a consolidated school for good. Now where did we go? Where did it go? Well, we don't know for sure. I suspect that most of them were demolished. We have aerial photographs from 1937 that show a lot of them as foundations in that time. So I suspect that those that were near agricultural land got quickly demolished. Others were just sort of left. There is a possibility, another one for you researchers out there, that some of them might have been moved, repurposed, used for some other use as storage, the way that Hilltop was. So, another thing that you can look into possibly. So there may be another school in existence that we don't know about, but they left very quickly. So by 1965, only Hilltop School remained of the original 7. Of course, Cherry still existed, but at that time, it was already part of the Sturgeon School District. Unprecedented in Door County history, this happened. I want to give you a little comparison here of what the difference is between Sevastopol and a near neighbor. And I apologize for any of you who are alumnus of Jacksonport School. We're not going to go into greater detail. The reality is that Jacksonport School is its own hour-long presentation plus. So if you like this, bring me back for Jacksonport. We'll do that as well. So here we have, kind of around the first half of the 20th century, the Jacksonport schools. We have Groveland here. On your far right, we have, or far left rather, we have Washington School up top, Fairview, beautiful there underneath it, and then on the far right, we have both iterations of Jacksonport School. So the second school here on top, the wood frame building, and then they rebuilt it in the 1930s and 40s. So again, this is an example of the more typical pattern for Door County schools, where we're trying to create better one-room schoolhouses. We're creating a high school, now we're creating upper level schools. We're trying to develop our school system without having this one big building. And so eventually, of course, they consolidate with Sevastopol in the 1950s, by the early 1860s. And as a result, this is what they all look like today, folks. Anyone own one of these? Any one of the owners here? Okay, good. Every single one of the schools that had consolidated with Sevastopol in the 1960s is still there. They've been converted to private businesses, private residences. Fairview, of course, probably the most well-known, sitting there in West Jacksonport, looking absolutely gorgeous. But even the ones that have more modern conversions and are just houses, you can easily see what they used to be. And this is very typical. And why is that happening? Why did they survive and Sevastopol's not? Well, Sevastopol made a choice, right? They said, we're getting rid of our schools, we don't want to go back. It's a different ethos. By the 1960s, we have historic preservation. We have interest in nostalgia. So this is where I want to end today. So I'm going to ask a broader question. Why do we care? I mean, that's always a question I like to ask as a historian. It sounds kind of crass, but who cares? I mean, there's a lot of history out there. Why does this matter to us? Why is it that schoolhouses are one of those things that fills an auditorium all the time? We love schoolhouses. There's a lot of reasons. They're a source of national pride. They're America in miniature, folks. They're a community coming together for a higher purpose and turning nothing into something. And that's what it's the American dream. One tiny little building. There's also a very good historic reason for it, and that most of the preservation started happening around the bicentennial. 1976, huge moment for historic preservation. Schoolhouses are top of the class for preservation there. It ties into our national heritage, so that's where you really start seeing it happen. In a broader sense, they're also sites of community. So schoolhouses did not just host school back in the 1800s. They were a full-fledged community center. Students were putting on entertainment there. They were sources for political meetings. The bell would ring if there was some sort of danger, some sort of weather event, similar to a church. They are functioning in that way. They are one of the only things holding these broad farming communities together is the schools. And somehow we remember that. We see that in them. As I've said, they're also an avenue for participation. Serving on these little school boards, these tiny little municipal organizations for these little schools, was often the first step for a lot of very prominent citizens. And it's a way for us to participate in our democracy. And it's a common experience. As you'll talk to anyone who attended one of these in the later districts that still survived, the memory of being part of those one-room schoolhouses is very powerful today. And that's why you see books like this Jerry App's book, The Little Red Schoolhouse, or the book Judy Jesse is writing about her work at Wanamaker School, where she taught at one-room schoolhouses. It's something that stays with people. And they're also very radical. They're catalysts for change. These were what prepared America for this rapidly changing world. The world has always been changing rapidly, folks. It was never the same for long. And it felt just as alienating back then as it did now with all these changes happening. And this is where that next generation got the schooling they needed. The community worked so hard to bring them into that place. It was a huge avenue for empowering women. Now, women served as teachers, obviously. But as you see, in the example of Sevastopol, by the turn of the century, these professional cadre of women, teachers, and also parents, were getting more and more involved, not just in the school, but in society as a whole, and using that experience in the school to shape their later life and shape their participation in society. It was one of those avenues that led us to women's suffrage and to place women in the occupied society today. And they reflect the changes in our society. And that's something that's interesting to me, in that schoolhouses show us where we are and where we're going. Just look what happened here the last couple of years. It both leads us and we follow it. It's a bellwether, but it's also a reflection. Without our schools, we can't really know who we are in a strange way. So I'm not from Sevastopol. Why do I care about this? Well, when I think about these schoolhouses, and I think about the empty spaces that are there, and that's something that I think a lot of preservationists, and a part of me too, feels very sad about, that we don't have more of it. We only have this one ruined schoolhouse left in this very important era. But I also think that we owe it to ourselves to look at the other side and think about what that represents for Sevastopol, what that tells us about this community, which is a rural community, farming community, so much like so many others across the state, that made this radical choice to consolidate when it was not convenient, when it was not easy. And as a result, ended up leading the way. And there's a couple of quotes that I love. I love this quote from Jonathan Zimmerman. He's a historian of education, talking about the way our buildings still live in us. And I feel like these schoolhouses are still present in our lives in a strange way. But I also want to read, kind of as my closing to this, something that was written in the Sevastopol Pioneer in 1925. So this is the first graduating class, the first full graduating class that was here in the Consolidated School. They spent their first 3 years at Sturgeon Bay. They finished their senior year in the new schoolhouse. This is their introduction to the Pioneer. We, the students of the Sevastopol Consolidated School, wish to express our gratitude to the people of the township who made possible this consolidated grade in high school. We admire the foresight of those who had a vision of what consolidation of schools could mean to the community. And we appreciate the sacrifice and labor on the part of those who made that vision a reality. In all of the great work, better results are apparent by reason of the fact that each teacher is able to do specialized work. We appreciate the advantages of being able to secure a high school education without having to leave our homes for 9 months of the year. Many of us would have been forced to leave school after completing the 8th grade if this high school had not been provided. We all enjoy the training in music, athletics, and social life which the complete equipment of the school has made possible. We feel confident that as time goes on, the members of the community will feel more and more that Sevastopol Consolidated School is an investment that will pay large dividends in happy, well-trained school children. Something to be proud of. I'll take questions. Yes?
Talk about Cherry School being turned to the Sturgeon Bay School District, but I've known that to be part of the Sevastopol School District. Some of these people here that attended Sevastopol went to Cherry School, came from Cherry School to Sevastopol.
Interesting. What date? That's the question.
60s.
I'm foggy on this, so I'll take correction on it for sure. Because it was a mess. This happened in the early 60s, so 1963, 64, 65, there was a massive legal case about which district got the schools. But I'm happy to, if it was...
From 68 would be...
68.
Special needs, your county.
Yeah, in 1968, they...
1968,
They
okay.
no.
Maybe they ended up back with it. Maybe they got the bone back.
It was kind of a York County thing for special needs.
Ah, okay. Okay. Well, Cherry School, like I said, it's a bit of a black sheep, so I definitely need to do more research on that. Thank you. I'd like to talk more about that. Yes?
And she Sturgeon Bay students were riding my bus for 2 years. And there was tension even on our school bus. They didn't want to go to Sevastopol.
Interesting. Was there a big rivalry, too, between the schools?
Oh,
At
yeah.
that time? I mean, I know that...
There's always been one as farmer schools.
Could you repeat the comments, please?
Oh, yes. The comment was that he rode the school bus with Sturgeon Bay students for 2 years, and the tension on the school bus was palpable. Which is interesting that they say that about Sevastopol, because that's what Sturgeon Bay students said about Southern Door, too. They need to vary their criticism a little bit. You can only say how high so many times. Yes?
May I add a little bit to your history?
Oh, please do.
So on Bassford School and the Bassford property that is very soft, the first school was actually a log cabin,
Okay.
and it was on the opposite corner where Maple Heights is, where the highway is. I'd probably taken down when the highway went through, I'm not sure. But it was moved over to the Rudolph farm, and they had him sitting on the farm. but they had a little trouble with some arsonists, and they burned it. So we have a picture of it burning. It's a log building
Do
burning.
you have a picture of it not burning?
Yeah.
Can I-
No, I
No,
mean,
I'll take a picture of it burning if I have to.
yeah, it's there. It's there.
This is half the reason I'm here, because this is what I mean when I say that, we sketch it out, the details, the community is the best equipped to fill it. It's that kind of personal connection that we love, so thank you for that. I saw references to a first Bassford school, which is why I fudged it. Now I can actually update it to be fully accurate.
And I can't help but wonder, when you look at the Bassford School, the doors and stuff, those double doors that we have, the Bassford house looks just like it. And I wonder if they didn't replace their house with the schoolhouse and build
I
up.
would not be at all surprised. Creative repurposing is very common in building around here in all of Door County history. I should know, this is the only picture we have of all 7 of them, and we don't have them labeled. So we can tell that this one is Hilltop because it had this unique door, but the other ones, we don't have any other pictures of them at all.
The lower left is,
There it is. Oh yeah, that's it. Of course, we have a picture of Zettel and it's dark. You can see with the darker paint. So, this is my other call to arms. We have very little information on these schools. And you'll see how few documents we had to show you. This is not the case with Southern Door and a lot of the other schools that lasted into the 60s. We have archival material, photographs, oral histories, all that good gravy. But because it was 1924, very, very tough to get all of that. So if there are any photographs, and clearly there were, these had to come, these are from the 1924 yearbook, right after consolidation. So those photos exist somewhere. Somebody took a picture of something. If it exists, please give me a call, because there is a lot of work to be done on these schools yet to bring them kind of up to snuff historically with the other schools. It's a big challenge because they're no longer there. But it's something for all of the very talented historians that I see here. We know who you are to think about. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Yes?
When I was in first grade, I rode in those old buses that they had.
Oh, the first buses? Oh, those are so cool.
And then they sold them to the county afterwards. And they got new buses.
Oh, those buses are amazing. They were custom
And
made.
they were just a seat on each side of the...
I always wondered what they looked like inside. Very comfortable, I'm sure.
Older people, older girls, we sat on their laps too. Everybody sat on somebody's lap.
They went all out. I mean, it sounds terrible, right? I mean, the alternative, it wasn't unheard of at that time for folks to be going to school in Orson Park still. So, especially in rural districts. They went all out. They had those buses custom made. They really wanted to dot all their I's and cross their T's and have the best schools they could have. Of course, they didn't pass muster 20 years later, 30 years later, but at the time, they were very innovative. Yes?
I went to Fairview,
Very good.
and I went there until 4th grade. And then they closed that down, the one in Jacksonport town, and we went to the winery in Carlsbad.
Oh, you went to Carlsbad for a while. Did you, for how long?
I went there for 5th and 6th grade, and then they closed that down, and everybody went to Sevastopol because they had that new addition on.
So you were from that fun generation that got to go to as many schools as they possibly could. I've often wondered about that. I mean, the late 60s and the late 50s and early 60s were a wild time to go to school in Door County with all of the changes that were happening as that second wave just phased out and they rushed to consolidate. We'll have to have a chat later. I want to hear all about it.
Stephen,
Yes?
there was one article in the newspaper in 1961, I think, when they were in the middle of all this consolidating with the other schools. And maybe grade 1 and 3, 1 to 3 was in one school on Carlos Road, and another one was in Sunny Point School, and one school over here. And we were trying to coordinate the buses so kids know where they were going. It's something that was a copy of what they wanted us to
And I know I've talked to Judy about what it was like a little bit later in Southern Door when they were trying to consolidate. I mean, it was tough. Sevastopol tore the Band-Aid off, and it was very rough for a couple of years, but you know, there were advantages to not having to kind of do it late. And that you didn't have to work that out. Everyone just, bam, we're in the new school. So a lot of foresight, in a lot of ways. Anything else, feel free to talk to me afterward too. I'd love to hear more stories. Thank you so much for having me.